It's on 376 in the Pew Bible, Job chapter 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God and turning away from evil. And 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions also were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. And that man was the greatest of all the men of the East. And his sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And it came about, when the days of feasting had completed their cycle, that Job would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "Perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came along with them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" And then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Hast thou now made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth your hand now, and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse thee to thy face." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not put forth your hand on him." So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. Now it happened on the day when the sons of his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, that a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans attacked and took them. They also slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another also came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I have alone escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 bands and made a raid on the camels and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another also came to him and said, "Your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in the oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they died, and I alone have escaped to tell you." Then Job arose and tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell down on the ground and worshipped. And he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. We were discussing in Sunday school how in our culture it is very common for us to compartmentalize and take grief, put it off to the side. We like to avoid pain. We don't like to embrace and talk about moments of loss because they're difficult. They're hard. But the question is always raised, and it's before us this morning. What do we do during moments when someone is torn out of our life? A friend, a family member, a church member, a husband, a wife, a child, a parent. How do we respond in these moments? I mean, we could suppress and compartmentalize it and put it off to the side, but sooner or later, we have to come face to face with the fact that we live in a world that is filled with loss and grief and death. And the question is, how do we react? The story of Job here, especially the first chapter, gives us a potent illustration as to how we can learn from one of our harbingers in the faith, if you would, as to how to respond when that type of loss and grief strikes very deep and very personal. We find in the story of Job, we have this introduction. And it's very critical to see the introduction for what it is. It is a setup to show us that even though in life many of the problems we face are brought upon ourselves by the mistakes we make, in the case of Job and the story of Job, that's not the case. Job, we find, is a righteous man. He's a wealthy man. He is a pious man. He is a man who takes the time to worship and seek after the Lord, and he's walking with God. Is he perfect? No. Is he a sinner? Yes. Does he need a Savior? By all means. But we find that as the story begins, that this is not something that Job has brought upon himself. We see in the next scene, after we're introduced to the character of Job, we're now in heaven. And we find that Satan is accusing Job to God's face. He's leveling this accusation, saying the only reason why Job is following after you, and the only reason that Job is a good guy, and the only reason why Job is making sacrifices and doing the things he's doing, is because you're paying him off. You're greasing the wheel. You're blessing him. If you took anything away from Job, he'd curse you to your face. This is just a giant trade-off, God, and that's exactly what's taking place here with this fellow by the name of Job. And God, in Dave's vernacular, said, "You don't know diddly, dude. I'll show you something different." And he gives the enemy permission to strike the servant Job. And what we find, as Job is now going about his business, he suffers 4 major losses in this first chapter. He'll suffer even more so as the book goes on, and that's the rest of your reading during the course of this week and so on. And that's what I'm putting out there for you guys. If to finish the rest of the story, we only have time to look at chapter 1. But in the course of the first assault, we find that Job loses his source of income. Now let's face it, many of us in this room understand that type of pain. We've lost jobs before. Some of us have gotten the pink slip. Some of us have seen our position eliminated. Some of us have seen sales drop, and now all of a sudden we're out on the street. He lost his income, number one. The second is that he lost his wealth, the sheep. Back in those days, you didn't have bank accounts and 401k plans and Roth IRAs. You just had a giant flock, and that was your form of investment. That was your form of savings and income there in terms of where you put your money. You had these flocks, and that would be something that you could turn into gold and you could trade with. So that was the currency of the day, was sheep. They're gone now. Loses his form of income, the farming. He loses his flocks, which is his wealth. He then, it tells us, loses what? His camels. Now that's an unusual thing here for a person in that day and age, because only the extremely wealthy were able to afford a camel. I mean, you had to be like the creme de la creme of rich in order to have a camel. So it was sort of like he had a fleet of BMWs and they're gone. And now his social status, his reputation, because that was what a camel brought, was a high standing in society, is now ripped from him. But the fourth loss is the most painful. And we find that he loses his entire family in one fell swoop. His children are gone. And with that comes a multitude of layers of bereavement and grief. The first is the actual pain of losing your own children. That's deep enough. All of them are gone. But on top of that, he is also losing, or has lost, his Social Security, if you would. Because in that day and age, they did not have Medicare, they did not have Medicaid, they did not have nursing homes, they did not have any sort of assisted living. Who's going to take care of him and his wife when they get older? There was nothing in place, and with his income gone, he's going to be destitute. So his future now has been snuffed out. Anyone to care for him as he ages. On top of it all,
and this is perhaps one of the most devastating pieces in that particular culture, is that when you lost all of your family like this and you had no one to carry on your name, that was considered one of the greatest dishonors a person can face. It is the loss of the family prodigy. And because now Job has no one to pass his name on to, his inheritance, his land, anything that he may have left, because that is gone, he is going to be considered cursed by God for all generations. And there was no worse of a humiliating act to occur in somebody's life during that day and age. Point number one in the story is that there will be times when believers and people who are walking with God will face deep, troubling pain. We will go through loss. We said this in Sunday school again this morning, that Jesus promised, in this world, you will have trouble. Then he goes on to say, take heart, I've overcome the world. But we're still going to have the trouble. What I wanted to camp on was Job's response. How does Job deal with the grief? How does he deal with the loss? How does he contend with this pain that he's going through? Everything has been ripped away from him. How does he react? He does three things in the passage. Number one, it tells us he tears his robe. Number two, he shaves his head. And number three, he worships. The tearing of a robe we find in the Bible is not isolated to Job. Tearing of a garment is associated in the Scriptures and in that culture with bereavement and grief. It's an outward expression of something that's happened within. Somebody's been torn away from your life. Sometimes they would actually use a knife and cut their clothes up. Sometimes they would just rip them with their hands. We see Jacob doing this when he finds out about the loss of Joseph. David tears his garment at the loss of his child. Elisha tears his robe when Elijah is taken away. And we see numerous examples in the Scriptures of people who have suffered tremendous loss, and one of the first things they do is they rip their clothes. I know of a rabbi out in Portland, Oregon. He was in a meeting. His secretary interrupts the meeting. He was notified that his oldest son was just killed in a car accident. The rabbi stands up in the middle of a meeting with a whole group of pastors. He grabs his suit and he tears the suit right open. And he cries out in this expression of grief. The second thing that Job does is it tells us that he shaved his head. And when we say he shaved his head, the hair came off with whatever he had on top, and then the beard, which was common in that day and age, was removed as well. And again, this isn't the first time somebody in the Bible is going to shave their head and crop their beard off. We see this in Ezekiel chapter 5. The prophet is told specifically, shave your beard as a sign of bereavement and grief because of the sin of Israel. Ezra does the same thing. He pulls his out. Nehemiah is so upset because of the sin of the Israelites and their adulterous affairs and things like that. He goes and he rips the beards out of other people. He starts tearing hair all over the place. It's like, dude, get your act together again. He grabs her by the face and he starts whacking hair. Why do they do this? Again, it's a sign of anguish. It's a sign of grief. It's a sign of pain, and it's a sign of loss. It's an expression of that, and it's letting it go. Why is this so important? Because the antithesis of not grieving and not expressing pain and not crying and not letting things out is internalizing. And when we internalize, we begin to self-destruct from the inside out. And the Bible is very aware, we see it throughout the Scriptures, that this is a necessary part of grieving. Back in October, just last year, there was a little news article that came out. There was an explosion on a runway in Japan. All of a sudden, planes were taking off, landing, flying, and all of a sudden, right in the middle of the runway, bam, something went off. Nobody was hurt, thank God. But there's this huge crater in the middle of this runway. And they send out teams and experts and bomb squads and everything else like that, and they discovered that there had been a bomb that had been dropped there 80 years earlier during the World War II. It was an American bomb that had been dropped. There's a number of them that they found in the area that was not, it didn't explode. And it was below the surface. It was under pressure. It was on this runway. And every day there's a little more pressure, a little more pressure, a little more pressure. For 80 years it's building up, it's mounting, it's mounting, it's mounting, and then finally it just blows up. And that's what some people look like when they don't grieve. And they don't express their pain. And they don't take the time to cry. And they don't take the time to let go of that inner hurt. And there's many folk today who have been carrying a load. And it may not be the loss of a loved one. It could be another form of loss of a job or some injustice that occurred in your life. And they're internalizing that. And they're carrying that around. And it's just a matter of time before your soul explodes. It's that important to grieve. And Job does so. The final act we see in here, he does something called shanach in Hebrew. And this picture of shanach carries with it this idea of bowing down, of worshiping, of submitting. Literally putting your face on the ground before the Lord. And he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gives, the Lord takes, the name of the Lord is to be praised. Worship is his response to loss. Because it's in the context of worship, Job is acknowledging the sovereignty of God, the fact that God is all powerful, that God has dominion over the creation, the fact that God has a plan and he is in control of that plan, that he has purpose behind everything he does, including the losses and the difficulties and struggles in life, and that God has possession over everything and we own nothing. I don't have a bank account. I don't have a home. I don't have possessions. I don't own my children. I don't own my spouse. I don't own anything. I am simply a steward. And so are you. And worship puts that perspective back into place. That God in his sovereignty, in his will, in his perfection will give and he will take. He will bless, and at times he will remove those blessings because he has an ultimate purpose in mind. And that ultimate purpose will be fulfilled. And he acknowledges that, and he praises God for that, and he submits to that. Because he realizes, as we see in the book of Ecclesiastes, that everything is beautiful in its time. Life as well as death. Little children coming into this world and loved ones departing. And Job accepts that. Worship brings us to that point of accepting. Worship opens the heart to saying, Lord, let your will be done, not my own. Worship opens the hands of the worshiper so that we may receive the blessing and the healing and the comfort from God. Because otherwise, if we're not in a posture of worship, what are we doing? We're controlling. We're taking back. We're holding on. We're choosing not to submit to God's plan. I find it interesting that secular psychologists and psychiatrists and counselors will all tell you that you go through these stages of grieving. You know, we'll go through denial, we'll get angry, we'll get depressed, but as soon as you can accept things, you're going to be on the road to healing. You know what? That's exactly what the scriptures have been saying for thousands of years. Job is saying, I'm accepting in this form of worship the loss that I've had to face, and in that acceptance, Job will begin to experience the healing power of God. The same thing holds true for us today. When someone near and dear to our heart is taken, it is that time when we accept that this was God's plan and purpose. In the case of Carolyn, the doctors had done everything they possibly could. Her body was shutting down. Her liver no longer functioned. Toxins were going through the system. And the family is left at this horrible juncture. And many of you understand what this is like. You don't want to see somebody suffer any longer. But on the same token, you don't want to let them go. And we ask ourselves the question, what do we do in these horrible crossroads when these decisions have to be made? And it's at that moment we worship. And we say, Lord, let your will be done, no matter how painful it may be. Because when we worship at that moment, God's will unfold, and we could experience His healing power. I wanted to wrap up this morning's message with an old Jewish story. It was told by the sages centuries ago. There was a rabbi who encountered the prophet Elijah. And the rabbi goes up to Elijah and says, Elijah, I want to know where the Messiah is. Can you show me, can you point me in the direction? Where has Messiah come, and what would he look like even if I were to see him? And Elijah looks at the rabbi and says, he's with us. And the rabbi, really? Well, we'll point him out, show him to me. Could you introduce me? And the rabbi says, yes. Let's take a walk with me, and I will show you Messiah. So they walk over to a nearby city, and as they approach the city, there's the gate in front. There's a stone wall with the towers, and there's this giant opening where people were passing through in the marketplace. And as they come to this giant gate, Elijah just stops and he says to the rabbi, he's over there. And the rabbi looks and says, well, all I see are these wounded men. And all across on the ground in front of the city gate, there was lying, dozens of these men with sores and with cuts, and they were weary, and they were in agony, and they were moaning in pain, and there's dozens of them out there. And the rabbi looks at Elijah and says, Elijah, the Messiah is here. Which one is the Messiah? And he says, just look, my son, just look. So the rabbi stares, and he's looking at this gate, and he's looking at these men, and each one of them has these bandages, and one of them is wrapping a bandage around his knee, and another one is wrapping a bandage on his arm, and another one has got a sore on his head, and he's putting a bandage on his head, and they're patching themselves up one by one, and the rabbi's looking, and he's looking, and then he looks over, and he sees this one wounded man laying there amongst the whole sea of others who are hurting. And he sees this one man reaching over and bandaging another. And binding his wounds. And the rabbi looks at Elijah and says, that's the Messiah. He's the wounded healer. That's our Savior. He's a wounded healer. And Isaiah tells us that he was bruised for our iniquities. He was crushed for our sins. And by his stripes, we are healed. When Jesus introduced himself as Messiah, he said, I've come to what? Heal the brokenhearted and to bind up their wounds. And we turn to him during these moments for salvation, to rescue us from sin. For he died in our place on the cross so that we could be forgiven. And we turn to him when we're hurting and we're hopeless and we're crushed and we're filled with anxiousness, realizing he is right here with us, mourning and struggling and reaching out in a way that only he can. And the only way you can receive that restoration and touch, is when there's a heart of worship. Job knew this. And I think we need to know it as well. In moments like these, I think our same prayer needs to be with him. Naked we've come, naked we depart. The Lord gives and the Lord takes. Blessed be the name of the Lord.